a good buyer is going to want to see 2 to 3 years of consistent financials, right? Where everything's categorized the same, everything is, lined out the same, and all that stuff makes sense. So, the first thing you want to do is get your finances in order, right? Make sure your books are straight, make sure your accountant has the stuff right, make sure your ad backs are in an area where you could easily say, look, these are all personal expenses or attributed to me or my own expenses that aren't necessary for the business. All your one-time expenses are going to be, lined out, and that your books and you can speak intelligently about it, right?
Representing Franchise Secrets, Erik Van Horn.
Dan, welcome back to the show. How long has it been? How many days exactly has it been?
I don't know about the days, but it's been a while. It's good to see you.
I remember one time, I think it's even out there. It just hit me. We recorded a podcast, I think, when we were in Mexico together, at one of those resorts.
I do remember that. I think we were down at the Four Seasons. I mean,
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. That was a nice race. But I think that was probably the last time. I've been hearing from a lot of franchisees out there about wanting to sell their franchise, or at least, like, when do I start thinking about selling? How do I think about selling? And sometimes I feel bad about even thinking about it. And so I've no better person to have on than you. I mean, you've sold a handful of different franchises as a franchisee, multiple different ones within different franchise systems, and you're actively a buyer of franchisees, existing franchisees right now. So you up for just a conversation around buying and selling?
yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I pick whatever franchise you want, but do you remember that first time in any brand that you're like, the thought of selling was entered your mind? Like, what was going through your mind the first time that you had actually thought about selling what you've started?
I think the first time was way back with the very first franchise, right? I never really bought that to sell it. I thought it was a business that I was going to do forever. And then I just remember at some point I was like, okay, I'm getting to the exit age where I said I wanted to retire for the first time, or at least be able to, and not have to work. And so that was kind of what started it for me, the process. And then, you kind of go down that rabbit hole of what do I need to do to make my business sellable. And at that point, because I didn't build the business to sell, I wasn't ready to sell, right? There was a lot of work I had to do to get that to where we could actually go to market.
So what are some of the specific metrics or things that you had to do to get that business to where it was sellable?
Yeah, so I guess two different things, right, Eric? I mean, that they're selling to a private party, they're selling to PE, they're selling to a bigger group, which we've done both. So that first exit was not big enough really to go to PE. And so the first thing was kind of realizing who's your audience, right? Who are you trying to sell to? Who's going to be the buyer? And then what are they going to be looking for? How sophisticated are they going to be? And what's going to be important to the buyer? Because at the end of the day, the business has to appeal to whoever you're selling it to. So whether that's cash flow, whether that's management in place, whether that's super clean books, whether that's processes, SOPs, all those things to do or to have in place for the buyer that are going to be important to them. You kind of have to go down that list and figure out, is he going to be a guy that's going to run the business? Is he going to run the team that runs the business? How are all those things laid out? And how do I appeal to that person? So I think that's the process. The beginning is one, understanding who the buyer is, and then what needs to be put together. Are they going to be self-funding? Are they going to be financing? How much cash flow are we selling? What's the purchase price, and who does that appeal to? Those were kind of like the first thoughts in my mind. And then once I kind of got my head around that, I was like, here's who the buyer profile is here, and then here's what I need to do to make this business look like something that guy would want to buy.
All right. So a follow up to that, you mentioned like the buyer, and let's say this is an existing franchisee or an entrepreneur that is wanting to get into that industry, whatever that franchise is. And a lot of times if they're, have some smarts, they're going to think like, well, I want some owner financing. I'm just not going to pay cash for this, or the bank won't give me enough, or whatever it is. So they want owner financing. As a seller, you don't really want to do owner financing because you want to just get out of it. So can you
Yeah.
talk about the advantages and disadvantages of, as a franchisee, owner financing to the buyer of your franchise?
Yeah, so well, and we can go to both sides of this, right? So as a buyer now, and then back then as a seller, what was important to me? So, I guess to back up, and you mentioned it as well, right? So if you're in a franchise system, it was, am I going to sell to someone with them? Or am I going to sell to the outside? That's also, a big thing as well, especially if you are going to seller finance or not. If you're going to seller finance, you kind of want to know that the person that's taking over has the ability to run your business well, right? You're betting on that person when you finance them. So long story short, I did seller finance a small portion of my first sale, but I also secured it with assets outside of the business, right? So, give you an example. When we sold that, I think I held back maybe $1 million, but I took a hard asset, which was actually a house that was paid off as collateral for that loan. So, it's something that I learned along the way through, reaching out to people in the training. You know, when you I think a thing that sticks with me from the beginning, whenever there's a seller financing note, it's really a license to renegotiate. So you have to be very careful. Either the seller is going to renegotiate or the buyer is going to renegotiate. More times than not, it's the buyer because she's going to get down the road. Once you're out of the business, you've got cash. He's got all your old cash flow. You've got everything in the world to really re-leverage you or push you to re-leverage. So one, either your contract needs to be really tight. You need to make sure that you've got, collateral just in case there's an issue there, which we actually did have an issue in our first sale. They ended up, having to get settled legally. But because we had these things in place, it was much easier. The leverage was more fair than not having an upside collateral.
So, as someone that's buying franchises, I'm sure you're probably asking for some financing as the buyer. You want the seller to finance. Is that, I guess, first of all, is that true? Do you want the sellers to finance part of that for you as a buyer?
It depends on the deal. I mean, I think now the way as a buyer, the way I approach it is actually I think you've probably been through some of these. You've had some of the same mentors on buying that I have, so we've been able to learn that process and through other people's examples. As a buyer, it depends on the deal. I mean, of course, I would want them to finance it. I would want them to finance it and carry it, typically as long as the bank would, which isn't really too common, right? So if you can get better terms with a lender, then I actually prefer that if I'm not worried about the business. There really isn't. You're going to get longer terms, better rates than if it's seller carry. So some of the deals we do right now, if it's an underperforming, situation, and the bank isn't going to be, or whoever the lender isn't going to be as interested in funding that deal, then I will go with a bar carry. But if it's a really solid cash flow deal, is what we look for now, then I'm almost better off, actually getting the terms from a lender than from a buyer, which is kind of goes against what most people might think.
Attention, franchisors and franchisees. There are two really important resources that I want to share with you that will help you avoid costly mistakes and increase your enterprise value. The first is our free Facebook group. It's a community that has over 4,000 franchisees and franchisors in it. When somebody asks a question, they get honest and authentic answers from multiple perspectives. You can join the group for free over at franchisesecrets.com/Facebook. The second resource I want to share with you is if you're a franchisor and you're frustrated that you're not awarding as many franchises as you thought you would, this is the reason I created the Franchisor Mastermind. If you want access to the information, the techniques that the best franchise sales organizations are using to award franchises, and you want what mature brands have with their playbook of having happy, successful franchisees that grow the right way, then you might want to check out the Franchisor Mastermind. The reason why people join is they want access to my Rolodex, my connections. They want the playbook to achieve both short-term and long-term success. They want to increase enterprise value in their brand. Links will be in the show notes or at scalablefranchise.com. Yeah, I like, as a seller, I would be more okay selling to somebody that has experience in the particular franchise already. They have a winning track record. They have capital. That would make me feel a lot more comfortable. If they don't have that, it's less likely that I'd want to finance that buyer. Okay, so you're going through all these negotiations and whatnot with the buyer and the seller. How do you handle like the emotional side of dealing with objections or dealing with terms and all that throughout the negotiations? I'm guessing you don't get very emotional with it, but some people might. So give us a sense of how do you deal with the emotional side of it.
Yeah, you got to disconnect completely from that. A lot of lessons, right, in the multiple businesses that. So I think the first one that I did, I spent probably 60 or 70 grand in attorney's fees writing that deal up. So it was super expensive. But I learned a lot, and like attorneys are going to tell you every worst case scenario. So in that process, I think where I was able to go was to say, all right, what there's only where I could get in trouble, right? And I have to look at it and say, okay, I don't want to go down that path, or I don't think that's too big of a risk. But at the end of the day, the attorney was the one that was actually able to set me straight in the beginning about, hey, don't be emotional about this. Don't worry about it. Let me handle that. So you absolutely can't bring emotion into it. There's a lot of nuances that go on, right? You really can't tell your staff. You really don't want them distracted. You've got somebody that's interested in your business. You're spending a lot of time negotiating with them through attorneys and whatnot. I think the most common thing, and the business that I sold with you, we had that issue. We got drug out so long through the process. There was emotions, there was partners, there was a lot of different moving pieces. You had attorneys involved, and you had a very, very, well accomplished buyer. I mean, that in that situation, we were selling to PE, so they knew exactly what they were doing. And so, as we got emotionally invested in it, our business actually, if you remember this, where our business actually suffered a little bit. And then when we got to the close, they came back and renegotiated the price at the last minute. And at that moment, it's really hard not to get emotional, right? So you just have to actually say at that point, like, we're gonna negotiate this. We're gonna knock. Where's the line in the sand? We're almost at the closing point, and this guy's trying to renegotiate the sales price. Moneybags is trying to renegotiate the sales price, but it's a completely emotional play on a very astute buyer's, you know, side to do that. So it is, incumbent upon I'd say, seller or me to make sure that we don't get emotional. It's super hard to do, but you just have to have that mindset that I'm not going to do it.
Especially as it gets drug on
Yeah.
and the business is suffering because you've been focusing on the sale versus the operations of the
Right.
business. It's natural for it to get emotional. And then
Yeah.
and I think it's pretty common for private equity or a really sophisticated buyer to renegotiate on something like that at the end. Like I hear that all the time from average Joe sellers. Private equity comes in and they're like, okay, time to renegotiate. I mean, I hear that a lot more often than I don't. What about you?
I think it's chapter one of their playbook. You just don't know what their playbook looks like the first time. They buy businesses all the time. You only sell them once or twice. So they're much, I mean, again, you got to kind of know the buyer, right? You got to know the buyer, know what they're looking at, and I mean that caught me off guard with the PE firms. But I'll tell you, the second time we sold the PE, I knew it was coming. So and sure enough, it came. So when the more you do it, which the average person sells and buys maybe one or two businesses in their lifetime, right? So, but if you're talking about PE, they're buying them, every month or multiples per year. So they're just a lot better at the game than you are, and so you're going to be at a disadvantage. But if you're on the other side, if you've got a broker and you've got a good team, you've got a good accountant, and you've got a good legal person behind you, and you put them all together, then between everybody, you should have a pretty good grip of what's going to be needed and how to deal with those things. And I would say that's probably most important, like just having somebody to bounce that stuff off of, because otherwise it'd be really easy to over emotionalize or take something the wrong way and blow up a deal. I mean, you probably see it more than me, but deals get blown up all the time because of emotions or expectations or changes in expectations. And realistically, it's just two different languages, right? A buyer's talking a different language than a seller. And so whoever can understand the other's, motive first and make the deal happen, that really is going to be the winner in the situation. And if you're buying a business too, like the last thing you want to do is go into a business with a bad taste of the sale that just took place. So you got to make sure you set your expectations right that way as well.
So, still along the lines of preparing your business for sale, what was the hardest part about preparing it for sale? And did anything catch you off guard during kind of that preparation?
No, I think my expectations were set right, up front. I don't really remember where they came from, but I think the fair expectation of building a business is that it's at least a year-long process, right? By the time you get your books in order, by the time you make sure you go to, uh, get everything in alignment, all your documents, you're basically gonna wanna have, a repository where you can put your books, where you can put your SOPs, where you can put your payroll, your staff, all the stuff that a buyer is gonna wanna see. You're gonna wanna put it, in a Dropbox type folder for them to access it when they get ready. So you have all that stuff done. By the time you get that stuff ready, you're talking about a couple months. Then you've got to find a business broker if you're going to use one that's reputable. He's going to market the business, and then you're going to start taking, then you're going to start getting the tire kickers, and you start getting leads, and then the due diligence process, the negotiation of the contract, the due diligence period. If there's going to be an escrow, if you've got lenders involved, and then there's closing, right? So it's easy to say to fail the business. A decent sized business is going to take at least a year from start to finish.
No, and that's kind of a good breakdown. And by the way, like just Google, go into ChatGPT and understand what a data room is, because that's what Dan was talking about, whether it's Dropbox or Google Drive. You should have a data room, whether it's a franchisee, especially franchisors. One thing at Front Street is we help our franchisors that are with us build a data room for eventually private equity to look at. But that's what we like to build. You should have something like that even as a franchisee, so there's access to that right away. All right, so here's I probably not spent too much time on this part of the question. It's still along the lines of preparing for sale, but how helpful or not helpful was the franchisor during the process?
I don't think the franchisor was involved in anything. I don't think they really care to be too involved in anything. And I mean, in the very beginning, they're going to need to approve your buyer typically. So you want to get them in front of them sooner rather than later. That's probably a key thing. Don't waste any time. And it's really easy to waste a lot of time on these things. So get the buyer or potential buyers in front of the franchisor right away. So hopefully, having a good relationship with the franchisor is good on that. Once they're approved, then really there's no involvement till the end. I mean, I haven't found any issues. And I've heard four stories with some franchisors, but I've never experienced them in regards to, franchisors not wanting for a specific franchisee to sell and then not approving the buyer and all that sort of stuff. But realistically, it's really the beginning and the end. Other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot of involvement just needed.
The one area, or if you're a part of a franchisor that has private equity that is the primary buyer, different private equity groups that are the primary buyers for these the local franchisees, you might need to start to understand from some of the sellers how that process works, because in most franchises there is a clause that the franchisor can buy that franchisee out. And that's kind of what Dan was referring to. Most time it doesn't matter. The franchisor is not going to do that. But at times the franchisor has relationship with these private equity groups where there's an initial buyer. They can go around that buyer and assign that franchise to one of the private equity groups. So it might not be the franchisor that buys it. It might be one of the private equity groups that is a very large franchisee within that franchise organization. So that's just something to keep in mind. Have you seen that at all, Dan?
No, I mean, like you said, I think you have to refer to your franchise agreement. Most franchisors do have the first right of refusal, right? So again, if you have them involved from the very front end, then I don't think we dealt with that at Sola. That was pretty straightforward. I mean, you had the PE firm buying the whole company that wanted to buy out too. So that was just a good deal. And that was an interesting play. I've done that play twice now. So initially, when PE comes in, there's an opportunity. I see a slim window if they're interested in contractual operations to bring your opportunity to light right away. Um, I mean, I liken it almost to the honeymooning period because typically the PE company at that point really, really loved the product and the brand. They haven't gotten in to figure out what, good and bad. So the cash flow looks great. It's probably one of the easiest times to sell if you have PE coming in and want to bring.
All right. So I hope my kids and wife are not going to listen to this one, because when you sell a franchise and you something that you've built, especially franchise founders are like this, but franchisees can be like this too. You've built something, you have employees, you have customers that you care about. and you want to find the right person to buy it. It's like if you were to have someone that was going to adopt your favorite dog in the world, you want that to be the right person. Now we've got these Shetland ponies at our like family ranch here, and I feel sorry for the person that would ever adopt one of those things. So it might be like someone that's adopting your favorite dog, or you are handing off one of these Shetland ponies, which are a disaster too. What's that mind? But like, where's your mind in selling a business like that? How much did you care about who that buyer was from a customer standpoint or an employee standpoint, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, like if you built your business, right, and you were involved in it, then you have connection with a lot of your employees, your staff, right? I mean, I think that's probably the key thing that I thought about, especially in the first business, was, hey, look, and I probably worried about it more the first time than ever before, or anytime after that. That's probably fairly normal. I think anytime you do something the first time, there's a little bit more anxiety or a lot of learning that goes on. So one thing I learned in the first sale, though, that actually surprised me, and I didn't really learn until after the sale, even though I was concerned about the staff, yeah, I wanted to make sure they were left in good hands. And realistically, the best way that you can do that is to make sure that the business is set up correctly, like their systems and the processes and the hierarchy, and the if this then that sort of things are all part of the business. I'll give you an example. Even though everything I've sold has been franchise based, think we always had our own repository of SOPs or secondary operating, things that we followed in our organization that may have supplemented or added to what the franchisor had, right? And specifically around like how do you execute certain things or who does what. So to me, that gives insulation to the staff, and that's kind of where I found my piece at that. Um, I think the other part in the first business that I sold that I learned was there is a pretty profound loyalty typically if you're a good business operator of the staff to you. And so while you really can't tell any of the staff during the sale process of what's going on, I think the transition period is crucial for the buyer. Or even as I'm buying now, I make sure that we do a handoff and make sure that we have a meeting. I make sure that the old owner is there and that he's supported, right? So those are things that I've learned from me selling that now when I buy, I do. Uh, I would say now it's just pretty. Again, it's a playbook, right? So if you do it right, there's a right way to do it. There's a wrong way to do it, right? Um, and a lot of it may be personal, right? Some people don't want to be involved, and some people do. I care about the people, so it was important to me that they understood what I was doing, why I was doing it, and that I felt like I was leading them in good hands, right?
Let's talk about negotiation, deal structure, terms. I know what you and I were like with part of this. Sometimes we want it straightforward. We just like, here's a price, here are the terms. Let's just get this done. And sometimes it's more like a chess match where you have to start out really high, or just leave things off the table that are negotiation tactics. You can bring them up at the right point and offer them as bargaining chips or whatnot. So what have you learned about negotiation? Whether it's like, do you like the chess match type thing, or do you like, here are some straightforward deal points, and do it that way?
Yeah, so and you know this just because we've worked together before. I mean, I'm straightforward. So I want to get the deal done. I'm going to tell you what's out there. But what I've learned is that's not how most people play. So again, in the very beginning, it's important to know if you're buying or selling who's on the other side and what makes them tick, right? So case in point, we talked about the PE firm. I mean, they're always going to beat you down at the end. So if you don't keep growing your business through the period of time that you're negotiating, you're going to end up that way. And if you keep growing it, then maybe you should be the one you're negotiating. So there's a bit of a chess match. So I think when you know what to expect, that's probably the most, the most critical thing. Um, as far as, actually dealing with negotiations of it, I think a lot of that's gonna be a lot more personality based, right? So how people like to do it. Do you like to put a deal together? Some of it is gonna just happen naturally. Things that you don't think about that you have to deal with, like what are the tax consequences of sale? So how do I want to structure the sale that way? That becomes an issue when you start papering stuff up. How do I actually transition this, to the individual, all the true ups that have to take place? That can be a pain in the neck. It can also be emotional for some people when they realize they just bought the business and now I've got all this in between stuff that I owe, right? So all those things become negotiation point that you kind of have to be aware of. And you really, I mean, I had no clue in the beginning that those were all going to become things that you have to, again, why it's a long process. The great thing now is, like you said, I mean, I forget all the time, you probably get a chat GPT and go like, what am I going to honor during a sale? and it's going to tell you these key things. But if you don't know what they are, you still don't know how to how to handle them commercially. I would say now, different than before, Eric. Like on the and again, understanding the buyer. So now, when I buy a business, the most important thing is to agree on a price and lock it in. And then before you spend a lot of time and money, start moving down that path of, hey, we have a price. At that point, that's really when the negotiating begins in the due diligence phase, right? So a little different than what most people think. And I think we experienced this with Sola too, right? Like we got into the deal without the price of the price, and then we realized, oh no, as they start looking at your financials, as they start looking at variances in your payrolls, as they start looking at variance in your sales month to month, they'll all trigger different things for different buyers that force them to renegotiate the deal a little bit, right? So you do end up and maybe it is terms that they want differently, or maybe it is true up that they want differently. There's all these different pieces that they could pull the lever to renegotiate or continue negotiating when you think it's done. So I would say now I'm a bit more, I guess hawkish in my approach to just say like, let's agree on a number, but then depending on who I'm buying from, they probably don't know what's coming either. And I just have to now walk them through it as a buyer. I've got to walk the seller through what they're going to experience, right?
So when you're negotiating, it can bring out the best and the worst in people. Right? We've seen that. What's the kind of the most surprising thing that you've seen, whether it's the best or the worst of people, when negotiating a deal?
I would say the hardest part of negotiating a deal is if you have partners. That was probably the toughest one. And actually the one I did with you, you had 4 partners. And so navigating everybody's needs in that sale was very difficult, right? Some people had different tax needs. They needed the deal to be structured this way because they didn't want the tax burden, right? And then you had some people like, no, I need the cash now. Oh, people, I don't really want to sell. So navigating all that with one buyer, 2, 3, 4 partners, one buyer, it can get a little hairy. If it's one-on-one, the worst thing is the attorneys, right? And so I think the way I approach that now with a buyer or seller is like, let us agree, and then let's have the attorneys paper what we agree on. Because if our attorneys keep going back and forth, this is going to take twice as long and cost 3 times as much. So now, I mean, I would just tell you, like, pro tip, agree on what you want to agree on face to face, buyer to seller. And then, remember the attorneys on the sideline, they'll do what you tell them to do. They're going to advise you that's a good idea, not a good idea, or here's your risk. But at the end of the day, your job as the owner or buyer seller is to say that risk is acceptable or it's not acceptable, and then tell them what you want them to do. If you let them run the show, the deal will never get done.
So what kind of advice would you give a franchisee that's probably 2 to 3 years out from selling? So they're listening to this podcast and thinking, I might be a seller at some point. And in reality, looking into the future, they sell 3 years from today. What should they start thinking about today before they get to that point of 12 months before they're ready to sell?
Yeah. First of all, I would back up and say that everybody's a seller at some point. So you should self-proof your business from the beginning every single time. And none of us do it in our first business. It's very common. It's normal that we don't do it. So it's never too late. But a good buyer is going to want to see 2 to 3 years of consistent financials, right? Where everything's categorized the same, everything is lined out the same, and all that stuff makes sense. So the first thing you want to do is get your finances in order, right? Make sure your books are straight. Make sure your accountant has the stuff right. Make sure your ad backs are in an area where you could easily say, look, these are all personal expenses or attributed to me or my own expenses that aren't necessary for the business. All your one-time expenses are going to be lined out, and that your books and you can speak intelligently about it, right? And then also I think the next thing is like what's going on in the market, who's buying, what are the multiples, what's the price going to look like, and who's going to be my buyer. So you can start that in your head, now. But the number one thing you have to do is get your books in order, because there's no bank will lend and no buyer, no smart buyer will buy if that's not in order, right? And then the other thing is just really start, I think making sure your team is ready to move on without you. So that might mean bringing in another manager. That might mean making sure that, if there's a gap in your business you're feeling currently, that is filled by somebody else. A buyer is going to want to buy a business that's fully functioning. It's like, if I'm going to buy a car and then all of a sudden the alternator's not in it, it's not going to run. It doesn't matter what I pay for the thing. And so if you're, as an owner, we put ourselves in the business and a part that's critical, makes the business worth less, right? So getting all those things ready. So finances, make sure the team's running, good without you, or at least if you leave, that it's still going to run good. Those are all selling points too, right? And then I would probably, I don't know where you start, whether it's an attorney or accountant. If you have referrals, I'd start having this conversation, and then start thinking about where are you going to list the business yourself? Are you going to use a business broker? Those are probably some pretty key things. The business broker is going to be pretty big expense to the sale.
You mentioned having your books in order, and to some that might mean many different things. Like someone might think, yeah, I get my taxes done every year. My books are in order. I send it all to Uncle Sam. And others might be thinking, what you're thinking about having books in order actually means. So can you dive into a little bit more specifics of what is it like to have your books in order as a small business owner or
Yeah,
large business owner?
I would say if you want to litmus test this for yourself, anybody who has a small business, the best thing to do, easiest thing to do is to go to your local bank or a lender and tell them that you want a loan based on your business, right? And they're going to tell you what they want. You're going to provide what you have, and they're going to tell you what they don't like. So, if you've got your income categorized wrong, if you've got, personal expenses running through your business, if you've got, you know, a bunch of employees that are, 1099 and are down to the contract labor line and maybe they're not supposed to be. If have all of maybe you have like 6 different categories of, employees. Maybe you have a salesperson, you have a manager, you've got, someone, whatever. It's best to have those all broken out too categorically so that a buyer can quickly see like, here's what a manager makes, here's what percentage of that is attributed to the sale. Here's what all of the staff that produces the product or delivers the service makes, right? So just the next level, it doesn't have to be overly complex. Balance sheet has to be in line as well. So, again, if you go to the bank and apply for a loan, they're going to make sure that all that stuff is in alignment. So if you want to look at this yourself, that's probably a good way to do it. But you got to look at business like it's its own entity, right? It's got nothing to do with you. So how does that thing look, on its own?
This is why it's a challenge to validate with successful franchisees. So just a little tangent. Franchise buyers validating with successful franchisees who are not sophisticated in their bookkeeping will say like, "Oh, I made $100,000 this last year," and like if you ask, "How much did you make?" $100,000, and then the buyer will be like, "Well, shoot, I thought I was going to make 300 because that's what the item 19 says." And but what you don't know is this buyer or the seller, or I'm sorry, the franchisee has $100,000 in wages that they don't include, and they are running their vehicles and meals and all kinds of education, other things through the business that add up to another $200,000. So in reality, it is a $300,000 business, and a bank would land based on a $300,000 business, but you think it's 100,000 because you took out $100,000 of distributions. So I think this is something that all franchisees should probably go through is try to get a loan on your business, or at least go talk to a banker and say, what would it take to get a loan against my business to start really understanding, do I have my books in order like I should? So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, if you've got a relationship with a local business broker and you're going down that road too, if it's a good one, they'll know how to look at their books with you and tell you what and help you get ready too. So that's all. That's an easier start too. Maybe if you don't, if you are going to use a broker, um, you know, they are quite expensive. So make sure that that makes sense for your business and you have that kind of calculated in. But if you don't want to deal with it yourself, it's a pretty good way to go.
All right. So why do you think most franchisees don't think about an exit strategy before it's too late? Like you've seen it, Dan. People wait too long to sell. Why do you think they don't think about it until it is too late or almost too late?
Yeah, I think it's a multitude of different reasons. It's actually why I became a buyer instead of a seller now too, because I think that there is a lot of people that are just buying, or buying a business thinking that it is the be all end all. That's the majority, I would say, of your first time franchisee, and you know, you, it depends on the franchisor. Shoot, a little bit, Eric. Does the franchisor really sort of set the tone for growing and running a business, or is it more a owner operator mentality, behind the scenes of that specific franchise? Fortunately, the very first franchise that I was a part of wasn't really they didn't really set us up to sell, but they did always have this CEO mindset. Like their whole training process, right, was around you being the CEO of your business. And so if you can get that into your mind and realize that this isn't, unless you are just running a small business, the small business, the owner is very involved and it's much harder to sell, right? So I think, the mentality has got to be kind of part of the culture, either of the franchise of yourself or maybe a group of franchisees that you kind of hang out with. And then if you don't have that, yeah, you don't think about it till it's too late. And like, oh crap, I want to get out of this. And there's only two reasons you really want to sell, right? Like you either have a life changing event, or your business isn't doing that well. And it's really hard to sell if you're not doing that well. But if you have a life changing event, like you're retiring or getting old or just moving on, then, you gotta be ready for that too.
All right. So what are you focused on this next year, next 2-3 years? Like what's the thing that gets you most excited about?
I mean, to me, it's kind of the same as it's always been. It's getting in, rolling up several of these things and having a team that runs them, right? So again, I've never been the guy to, I don't know if it's just laziness or whatever, but I've never been the guy that wants to be on the schedule or doing the work. And so what I enjoy is picking these things up, knowing what it takes to put them together, knowing how you put a team that runs them, and then making them basically marketable from the beginning to somebody that wants. But I don't know when or if I want to sell, but I want to be ready to in case I need to. Something happens in my life, and I decide, hey, on a whim, I'm ready to sell. I'm gonna make sure my stuff's in order. So I found that's my sweet spot, Eric. I've gone across the whole gamut with franchising. I really like just multiple operations, building a team and then making it more and more efficient, more and more profitable. I mean, that's where I kind of landed on after all these years of what I really enjoy to do.
I love it. We don't have time, but I wanted to start going into partnerships because you and I have been partners multiple times and have multiple other partners. So we're not going to wait another 5 years before you come back on and do another podcast. I'm going to rope you even one on partnerships. You up for it?
Yeah, man, that sounds great. I love to do it. So I like this. We'll keep it one topic at a time.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Franchise Secrets podcast. Links to everything can be found over at franchisesecrets.com. And if you want my help with anything from starting your own franchise to growing your current franchise business, please visit scalablefranchise.com.